Next morning, I wanted to ask the commander about the crimes committed against civilians by Janjaweed and why the UN want him investigated for alleged war crimes.
When the world thinks of Darfur and they think of the Arab tribes in Darfur, they think of the rapes and the looting and the pillages. Are your men responsible for that?
Hamdan said he wasn't responsible for what others had done. His men had only fought insurgents. And when the government ordered him to carry out operations in civilian areas, he refused.
And he says that he is willing to put his hand on his heart and say that he is responsible for his men and he knows what his men did and didn't do, and they didn't commit atrocities. He knows the world thinks his men are Janjaweed, but in his culture, a Janjaweed is a bandit who rapes and loots. His men were part of an organized force, therefore to call them Janjaweed is wrong. The men then produced what they said were army ID cards. You can see in Arabic it says identity for officers and soldiers, armed forces, commission for intelligence and security, and there's actually an ID number.
They said all the men had cards like these, proving they were part of the government's forces. Hamdan said he'd welcome an investigation into his men's conduct. Hamdan wanted to show us that African villagers were still living close to the garrison, to reassure us that his men weren't murderers. After all, Janjaweed have burnt non-Arab settlements all across Darfur.
They're just taking us to a nearby fort village because I think show evidence of conciliation between Arab and non-Arab tribes. Commander Hamdan's talking to some of the village elders by the look of it. This is Ishaq Abdurrahman, he's the tribal sheikh here.
The sheikh said Arab bandits had attacked the village early in the conflict, but that Hamdan's forces stepped in to protect them.
So would you describe him as a friend? The sheikh says, when I say that he's my neighbor, I mean that he's my brother.
If the sheikh's sentiment was genuine, this scene doesn't fit with the accepted story of Darfur. Arabs and Africans seemingly living peacefully together. At the garrison, we saw something else totally unexpected.
This is a new intake. These soldiers came in after the group defected from the government. What's interesting is that this force is not all Arab. There are both Arab Darfuris and non-Arab Darfuris who previously were on very opposing sides of the fence, and they signed up to be a rebellion against the Sudanese government together.
Hamdan has already signed treaties with some African Darfuri rebel groups, his former enemies. He knows this will cause the government deep anxiety. There's no love for the Sudanese government here. The men say it stopped their salaries once it no longer needed them. And despite its promises, their villages remain deeply poor.
This is Hamid Ibrahim. He's one of the oldest fighters in the force.
He said he joined up to fight for his people, the Arabs, but he felt the government used him and then betrayed him.
It slowly dawned on him, as he put it, that he was sleeping under the trees and the government was sleeping in air-conditioned buildings in Khartoum. And eventually he realized that he needed to defend himself against the government.
When we asked the Sudanese government to respond to this program, they blamed the Darfur crisis on the rebel groups. They didn't deny mobilizing civilians into militia in response, but they say these are different from the Janjaweed, who they deny backing. At the end of our second day in the base, we heard that a tribal gathering, including Commander Hamdan's brother, wanted to speak to us. They hear all these words about them on the radio, in the international media, and they came here today because they wanted to ask us as journalists to explain to them whether there was a chance that not all of them could be seen as devils on horseback. He told us they feel marginalized, exploited by a government that has failed their community and made them its scapegoats for the civilian toll of the conflict. He says he has a message to the international community that they have never heard the Darfuri Arabs' side of the story. He says, we're the first journalists to reach them, and it's 5 years into the conflict.
Next morning, we discovered the government had made an offer designed to bring the movement back into the fold. Things were tense at the camp.
Commander Hamdan is in a meeting with his senior field commanders. They might not look like much, sat cross-legged at the bottom of a dried riverbed, but what you're looking at back there is the senior command of the most potent fighting force in the Darfur conflict.
The commander told us the government was offering cash to help develop Arab villages and a share in power. And the leadership knew the government had been trying to persuade their commanders in the field to switch sides. Events began to move quickly.
We've been told by the commander's chief of staff that a deal between them and the government is not going to go ahead by the looks of things. People have been gathering at our camp all morning to feed us different snippets of information. It became very clear that these guys were thinking that clashes with the government is very likely.
The leaders called a meeting of their top men. At stake, whether the biggest fighting force in Darfur would rejoin the government or become its enemy.
All of the force commanders have been gathered here. There's a really consultative process in Arab tribes here. And even though Commander Hamdan might be the overall commander, he has to make sure that he's consulted his men and his men are on board before he can go forward with any decision he makes. The officer who's standing there now is putting forward the case for going back to war with the government. He's saying, I look around at you, the blossom of manhood, and I know that we are not here for fun. We are here because we have grievances, we have genuine grievances.
It was clear the men felt the government still needed to do more to regain their trust.
It's incredible to be at this gathering, to be at a gathering of people who have never been before seen by the world's media, but to be at one of their most important meetings.
Commander Hamdan now knew his men were solidly behind him.
He wants you to film this.
His message to the government: give me what I want or face the consequences.
The commander is saying this is the second time that they haven't delivered. And within the next 24 to 72 hours, we are going to make clear to the world what our position from them is. And he said we will fight them till Judgment Day.
A few days later, the government gave them what they wanted. Without their Arab allies, the Sudanese government might be forced to give way in Darfur. The Janjaweed know they control the balance of power here, and they're going to exploit it.